Chapter 14. "So, have you really found him, Fenton, my dear?" Amelia asked quietly, rousing him from his thoughts of the past.
"It would appear so."
He stood up and approached the bed, nearer to where she was unpacking. She lifted an eyebrow slyly. "What do you plan to do with him?" He glanced at her inquisitively. "Do not suppose I'm ignorant of your dealings, Fen," she smirked. "Surely your estranged brother had more reason than mere cordiality to summon you after all these years. He needs you for something, and it seems to center around Paxton."
Fenton sighed and smiled at her. "You were always too shrewd for my own good, Amelia," he teased, wrapping his arms around her slender waist. "Oh, my dear, you smell so sweet," he purred, as his cheek caressed the wisps of hair that had escaped captivity and now rested along the length of her cheekbone. She laughed tauntingly.
"That doesn't answer my question. I know you didn't send for me simply because of my fragrance."
Momentarily, Fenton considered continuing his attempt to distract her with physical pleasure, but thought better of it. His eyes flashed, illustrating his annoyance, and he reluctantly released her. His wife had turned out to be a good deal cleverer than he'd first supposed. Secretly, he wondered if sometimes her wit rivaled his own. She always seemed to know what was going on in his mind and what he was up to. Once, a couple of years into their marriage, he had dallied with a very wealthy lady. He'd had other discreet affairs, but this was the first dalliance with a lady of his own station in life. Her husband, a wealthy merchant named Mr. Sawyer, had recently passed away, and had conveniently left her all of his money. Naturally, as did every other single man in the city, Fenton wanted a slice of that wealth. He thus determined to win over the widow's lonely heart, con money off her as the affair progressed, and string her along with promises to leave Amelia, which he might even keep, if the right circumstances presented themselves. Other men courted Mrs. Sawyer just for her wealth, but for Fenton the allurement was as much a chance to annihilate the competition as to gain financially. True, he was not a single man, though he dismissed this little detail hastily, feeling it was not a compelling enough reason to give up such a marvelous conquest. The fact that he was a married man infuriated the widow's suitors all the more. She'd often inform Fenton of their warnings against him, and he, in turn, would laugh, and then focus his attentions on playing the needy lover. The woman had loved his pretentious desperation for her. He would tell her stories of his unhappiness with Amelia and his dire situation in life, which were, of course, entirely fabricated. He knew women loved to be needed, and it was an added bonus, in most women's minds, if they felt they were outdoing another woman. The affair had been going along splendidly for about a year. The widow was tremendously stupid, but very adoring and gullible, the perfect candidate for such a ploy. She had, however, begun to grow impatient with his promises to leave his wife. His tactics of avoidance were growing old even in his own ears. Fenton had to choose between Amelia and the widow soon. Mrs. Sawyer was from a fine American family, while Amelia was from a rather tiresome British line. Mrs. Sawyer certainly had more money. Amelia had only a pittance for a dowry. The choice was obvious, although he found it difficult for some unknown and probably absurd reason. One afternoon he'd left his very prominent and influential job at the bank, bound for Mrs. Sawyer's, on the verge of convincing her he'd finally made up his mind to end it with Amelia. He'd been dumbfounded to find the latter sitting in the parlor with the widow. He'd been so shocked to see her there that he'd halted in mid-step. There was an awkward silence, and at an appropriate moment Amelia had spoken. "Fenton, my dear husband, I had no idea you claimed an acquaintance with Mrs. Sawyer." He had instantly recognized something in her tone that clearly indicated the opposite, at least to him. "I had just come to ask Mrs. Sawyer to join in our charity auction this week. Many ladies already on our committee had mentioned her admirable talents and assets, and we're so busy, you know. Finally, I said, 'Ladies, why is Mrs. Nancy Sawyer not a part of us, especially when she has so much to offer?' Everyone just shrugged, and so here I am, as you see, to ask you to join." Amelia had given a very uncomfortable Mrs. Sawyer a gracious smile. "And we've had such a nice time getting to know one another, haven't we? But, Mrs. Sawyer, why didn't you tell me you knew my husband?" The widow had visibly paled, and Fenton knew no adequate answer would slip from her lips. "I suppose you didn't put the two of us together, did you, Nancy?" He smiled jovially at her, and then turned to his wife. "I've been assisting Mrs. Sawyer with the investment of her late husband's funds, and with her choice of suitors as well." He then turned to Nancy, hoping that she would be accommodating enough to verify the tale. "That is true," she admitted somewhat sharply. "I'm lost when it comes to marriage. So many men are after my late husband's fortune, truth be told. I've no idea who to trust." She'd fairly glared at him, and right then his relationship with the widow Sawyer was over. No amount of smooth talking from him could change that. Amelia nodded, and her tone was dry as she declared, "No one knows people's characters and what their true intentions are, like my Fenton. Have you chosen a prospective husband?" Nancy had looked directly at her and stated firmly, "I believe I'll remain single. No one even holds a candle to my late husband, at any rate. I prefer to have his memory be my last." She'd stood up. "Thank you for considering me for the committee, Mrs. Stanton. I'll definitely consider it. Now, if you two will excuse me, I have some things I need to do." With that, she had, with a few more courtesies, ushered them out the door, and with a final scathing glance at Fenton, closed it quite firmly behind them. He had looked at Amelia, and she'd said, "Interesting woman." The rest of the trip home had been in silence, but once they'd got home, reaching the privacy of their bedroom, he'd had to ask her, "How did you know?" She'd looked at him coyly. "The same way I knew about the others." "Oh, don't act so surprised. Do you think I'm blind, Fen?" "No. Have your petty affairs if it makes you happy, but don't for one moment think that I'll let you go without a fight." He hadn't a clue what to say next. He was outright flabbergasted, not to mention caught red-handed. Amazed for a moment, he'd considered with some wonder why he didn't even feel angry that she'd become involved. Perhaps he was relieved, though he couldn't quite figure that out yet. "What did you say to her?" he'd asked, unable to utter Nancy's name. "I just spoke about how happy I was with you, and how we were just starting a family." He'd looked at her sharply. "You told her what?" "That we're going to have a baby." Ah! He'd grinned with admiration. Very clever, Amelia. She didn't have a chance. What woman in the world could stand up to that tactic? "You like my little ploy, do you?" "Yes, I rather liked it myself," she'd conceded. "Particularly because it happens to be true." "Fenton, what on earth are you thinking about?" Amelia snapped her fingers in front of his eyes to bring him back to the present. He realized he must have been out of it for quite some time, as she'd finished unpacking. "Nothing important. Now, my darling, why don't you come over here and show me just how much you've missed me?" She shook her head. "I want to know what's going on." He removed his suit jacket and began unbuttoning his vest. "Dearest, I know how tenacious you can be, but it has been more than a week since I saw you, and more than a month since He looked her body up and down, relishing her appearance. "Truly appreciated you. We can discuss things tomorrow." It had been a long while since he'd desired her this much, and he would not be deterred. Amelia, perceiving the potency of his passion, and likewise realizing this opportunity did not happen often, dropped the subject and melted blissfully into his welcoming embrace. Paxton had been sitting at the kitchen table, drumming his fingers back and forth along a board of wood thoughtfully for about an hour, when Elizabeth placed a hot bowl of stew and a plate of hot buttered bread under his nose. He was completely unaware of how long he'd been sitting there, recalling all of the unpleasant memories that accompanied thoughts of his youth. Elizabeth gently touched his hand. "You don't have to tell me the rest of your past, Pax. Not if it causes you this much pain." He grimaced, picked up the bowl, and wolfed down his stew and bread as if he hadn't eaten in days. There was a loud crash and a flash of light. Elizabeth got up and went to the window. "A storm," she stated, folding her arms and noting the commotion in the barn. "The animals are restless."
"Then it's likely to be a big one,"
Paxton commented, feeling much better with some food in his stomach. He stood up, walked over to his wife, and wrapped his arms around her. Together, they both watched as the wind whipped through the trees and lightning rent the sky. "Do you think things will be all right?" asked Elizabeth. Paxton could smell the soft hint of lavender on her hair and skin.
"I hope so, Lizzie."
She turned back slightly and tilted her head upward so she could see his eyes. "Paxton, I love you." His grip on her tightened affectionately.
"You don't know how it makes me feel to hear you say that,"
he whispered tenderly. Looking back out the window, she took in a deep breath of the crisp, damp air. The rain started to fall in intense sheets and pounded heavily on the roof. "Oh, I think I do," she replied softly. They stood there for some time and watched the raging storm, both content to listen to the rhythm of the rain.